Hello everybody, welcome back to another episode of The Sandman. Now, this is a bit of a different episode. Unfortunately, my microphone was off at the time of this recording, like of doing the footage, because I wasn't feeling very well, and so I was really tired and I wasn't really thinking straight. So unfortunately, there's no mic sound. There's only the video audio. So this is going to be a commentary of the game footage. So I do apologize for that. But I will try my best to kind of let you guys know what was going through my head and let you guys know a little bit about like the game and stuff like that. So it's not just complete silence and no talking, because that's not really what I want to do on my channel. So around this point, I was explaining that I wasn't feeling very well. I was tired, and my mouth had been sore for the past few days. So I was apologizing for the fact that I might sound drowsy and sleepy. And in this video, with the commentary, I do apologize. I might sound very awkward. I currently have all my teeth gone. At this point, this was before I got my back teeth, like the rest of my top teeth removed. But I was basically saying, like, okay, let's get straight into this. I'm very drowsy. I don't know how well I'm going to be able to do this, but let's get straight into it and see how things go. And I was basically saying, like, I've never gotten to this point, so I don't know what to expect. So I'm like, here I'm basically trying to figure out, like, okay, well, this is probably a maze. And I get here and I'm like, okay, yeah, I'm like, okay, is this a new area? I'm like, no, okay, so it just brought me back. So this is clearly a maze I've got to get through. So I'm like, okay, let's try up. And it didn't work. So I'm like, okay, well, let's try down. So down worked. And here, I kind of derped, and it was the last path I took. So I'm like, okay, let's go this way. No. Okay, what about up? So I'm like, okay, let's try up. I'm like, no. Okay, so it's literally the last path that the very last path. I'm like, okay, that makes sense. So, around here, I was like, okay, this is actually kind of nice, like, I like the background, I like the way that the trees are done, it's a really nice area. So I went in here thinking, like, okay, maybe there's something in here that I need. So I started looking around. I'm like, okay, there's nothing. I'm like, oh, barrels. Anything in them? And I'm like, okay, no. And I'm like, oh, okay, that's a stump. I thought that was like some kind of like weird monster coming out. So here, I heard the song. I'm like, okay, so it's not just in my head. There really is singing. So I'm like, okay, let's just run across. I didn't know what happened there. I did not know that I was, what killed me. So I'm like, what the heck was that? Why did I die? Did the singing kill me? So I decided to go back. I'm like, okay, let's try this and see what goes on. I'm like, okay, let's see if I can remember the way I'm supposed to go. So I'm like, okay, I'm pretty sure I went up. And then I think it was, and I didn't realize, I'm like, okay, no, it's not that way. I'm like, okay, so yeah, it was down. Because I couldn't remember if it was down or left. So I'm like, okay, it was down. And then this one, I'm like, which direction? I think it was, I'm like, I'm trying to remember which way it was. I'm like, okay, I think it was diagonal. So I'm like, okay, was it diagonal? I'm like, yeah, okay, it was diagonal. So, like, I was trying to figure out, like, which direction I had gone. So I'm like, okay, let's get back there. So I'm like, okay, what am I supposed to do? So I actually I'm like, okay, maybe I'm supposed to go through, and I'm supposed to go back. So I tried going back, didn't work. And there, I realized that it was actually a shadow. So skip forward about, 6 more deaths. And I'm like, okay, well, there's a ledge down there. Maybe I'm supposed to go down to that ledge. So I'm like, okay, let's, keep trying to go down. And I'm like, oh my god, it worked. So it's like, oh shoot, messed that one up. So I'm like, what the heck is this? It's like a snake woman. Oh my, it isn't a tasty prey at all. It's a girl. Shouldn't have come out in the first place. Something like, well, that's rude. Who are you? You don't know me? I'm Nexie. Nexie. that fairy who lives in the swamps? Yes, indeed. I thought a handsome young man came along, but she's a squirt. Oh, I'm so peeved. So at this point, I'm thinking like, okay, this is kind of weird. Say, could you bring me something nice? I'll let you go through if you do, otherwise no dice. What? But why should I? I need to go see the Sandman. Please, let me through. No can do. I'm in the mood for a shiny coin. Bring it to me. Alright, chop chop. I'm like, okay, where the heck am I supposed to find a coin? So I'm like wondering, okay, maybe there's a coin inside here. So this guy comes and I'm like, oh my god, what is that? And I'm just like, dude, your teeth. Hey, what are you doing in my house? Don't you know to knock? Rude. So at this point I'm thinking like, what the heck, like what's going on? Sheesh, didn't even notice ya. Come on now, out with ya. Who are you? Have you forgotten about me? The nerve of this kid. Why should I know who you are? Come on now, girl. I'm the Tooth Fairy. Tooth Fairy? You mean... That's right. When you were little, I did, under the pillow and all that. What are you talking about? The Tooth Fairy doesn't exist. That wasn't a fairy. It was my dad. Nah, stop. Say no more, my girl. Seriously. A fairy dies every time you say that baloney. There's few enough of us as it is. And I'm like, oh yeah, that's right. Fairies die if you say they don't exist. Right, so as long as we're clear. But if you have no business, skedaddle. I've got work to do. So I'm thinking like, okay, maybe he can give me a coin, because like he's the Tooth Fairy and all. So I go talk to him. What, got no business? Then out with ya. Got no business. I'm like, okay, so what am I supposed to do? So I go back to her, thinking that maybe she'll give me a tooth. And all she does is tell me about something, and I'm like, okay, no, this doesn't really do anything for me. So, it's like, okay, yeah. So I'm just like kind of blah blah blah, listening to this. I'm thinking like, okay, maybe there's like a hint here or something, but she's literally just talked about skincare. So I'm like, okay, maybe I can go by. Just like, oh, no, you can't. So I'm like, okay. So then, at this point, I remember that I have a tooth. And I'm like, wait a minute, I have a tooth. Because I had a lost tooth, I'm like, okay, maybe there's one here. I'm thinking like, okay, and then I go and look, I'm like, oh yeah, I've got a tooth. Right. So I go over to this guy and I'm like, hey, I got a tooth, do you want it? Can I trade this tooth for a coin? No, that won't do. I don't want this big hunkin' thing. I collect children's teeth. That one fell out to be, ones that fell out to be replaced by new ones. I don't take adults. So I'm like, okay, maybe I gotta go talk to this chickie and she'll give me something. Because she mentioned a grass that, like, makes something young. So I'm like, okay, okay, can't go through. So I'm like, okay, talk to her. So I thought maybe she would give me the item that I needed to shrink the tooth to make it a child tooth. So I'm like, okay, it's like, okay, she didn't give it to me, I'm like, maybe she can. So I'm like, okay. So I'm like, well, I mean, there's grass, in the forest where I first started. So I'm like, okay. So I'm thinking like, okay, maybe I gotta go back to the Tooth Fairy and ask him, talk to him, be like, yeah, okay, So I thought maybe like it was already shrunk. I'm like, okay, maybe. But it's like, okay, no, he doesn't do anything. So I decided, I'm like, you know what? Okay, let's go double check what the color of that grass was. Because at this point I'm thinking like, okay, maybe I gotta go and find it myself. So I'm like, okay, what do you gotta do with the tooth? And she doesn't let me do anything, so I'm like, okay, so it's not that way. So I'm like, okay, she doesn't do anything, she doesn't give it to me, so I'm like, okay, maybe I gotta go to the starting area and find it there. So I'm like going through and I'm like, okay, let's see what I'm supposed to do here, and so I'm like, okay, there's grass, so what's this one? That's not the one I need, that's not the one I need. And I'm like, okay, she said light blue. So I'm like, okay, let's... And then I realized, like, wait a minute, that's the way I wanted to go. So I'm like, wait, no, I want to go back this way, so I might as well just go with here. And I'm like, ooh, this, like, that's it, that's the light blue one. So it puts it on the tooth, makes it a kid's tooth. So I'm like, oh, okay, sweet. I got a kid's tooth. So I'm like, okay, it's a baby tooth now. So I'm like, okay, maybe I go back. So I start heading back. And at this point, I'm like thinking, like, okay, maybe I gotta, like, I'm checking around everywhere, like, okay, is there anything interesting, anything useful? So I go back, and I'm like checking behind the trees, stuff like that, see, like, okay, is there anything there? Nothing in that tree. So I go back here, and I'm like, hey, tooth fairy, I got a baby tooth. I'm like, hey, look, I brought a child tooth, give me a coin for it. So I'm like, okay, now that's what I trade for, and I'll sleep on the bed there. Why? I shove the coin under while the children sleep, so they don't see me in the act. Wake up on me and no coin missy. But I can't sleep. I have insomnia. Oh, is that right? Well, if you can't sleep, pretend then, alright? Close your eyes. Indulge me. Your bed's also too small for me. Then lay on top. Sheesh, you're too serious, you are. Reminds me of someone. So yeah, basically, like, we go through the whole motion of, doing this. Like, can I open my eyes? And then it's like, sure. And then I get a coin. And it's like, oh, yay, coin. I'm like, thank you. And right as the game says thank you, I'm like, oh, thank you. I'm like, funny. I said thank you at the same time. So I'm like, okay, so I gotta go to that chick. I think this is all I needed. So I'm like, okay, let's get going, and so I go over, give her this, and it's like, okay, I can pass. So I checked to see that she took the coin. So I'm like, okay, she took it. So I'm like, yay, I can go by. So at this point, I'm thinking, like, okay, what are these things? And I'm like, okay, I might as well save, So I go through and I'm like, okay, what are you? Nothing. And I thought maybe there's something I was supposed to do with these guys, so I start clicking a bunch of them, and I'm like, okay, do they have, like, different sounds? No. So, like, I'm thinking, like, okay, what am I supposed to do? I'm like, okay, what are these things? And I figure out, like, okay, I don't think I can do anything with them right now, so I'm like, okay, let's continue. So I start wandering around, and at this point, I had no clue what I was doing. I had no freaking idea. I didn't know what I was supposed to do. So I basically just wander around. And I was going to cut this part out, but I figured it wasn't very much wandering, so there wasn't really much point in cutting it out. But I'm just like, okay, you know what? Let's see if I can figure out what I'm supposed to do. So I start, like, thinking, like, okay, maybe there's something around here that I need. And I'm like, okay, anything. I'm like, oh, it's this. Can I pick it up? I'm like, okay, I guess I can't pick that up. So I start trying to wander again. I'm thinking, like, okay, maybe I can go in there, but I couldn't. So I'm like, okay, let's see what else is around here. And I was, like, fully confused at this point. Trying to figure out what to do. So I noticed the stump. And then this log. And I'm like, ooh, a colorful log. I'm like, oh, okay, I can go inside of it. Maybe there's something I've got to do inside. So I kind of just wander around inside here. I'm like clicking everything. I'm like, okay, is there anything I'm supposed to do in here? Like clicky. Nothing going on. I'm like, okay, guess not. So I'm thinking, like, okay, maybe I've got to, like, and I'm like, okay, maybe there's just got to be something in here. So I'm like, okay, it's really not anything in here. So then I start, like, clicking, like, in different places as I'm walking. Nothing was happening, so I'm like, okay, I guess I just don't use that, or, like, it's something for later on. So I'm like, okay, gotta figure out what I'm supposed to do here. So I try going back to the pond. Like, I tried going back to this area thinking, like, okay, maybe there's something here, maybe there's, like, an entrance somewhere, but there wasn't. So I'm like, okay, maybe there's something in this pond, maybe, like, there's a secret area or something like that I can get to. So I'm, like, clicking on the pond thinking, like, okay, maybe there's, like, a trigger, but there wasn't. So I was thoroughly confused, and I'm, like, thinking, like, what am I supposed to do? So I figured, I'm like, okay, you know, is there anything here? So I think maybe the cell phone has like some kind of hint, but then it's like, no, okay, it's just the clock again. So I'm like, okay, that's not gonna help me. So I go back out. I'm thinking like, at this point I'm thinking like, okay, you know, maybe Chicky has something. So I'm like, oh, maybe there's something up here. No. I go down thinking like, okay, anything down here? No. So I think maybe this chick can tell me something. It's like, hey, can you tell me where the Sandman is? Oh, that's right. You did say you have business with Sandman. I never want to see that stubborn old coot myself. Just go straight ahead, and there's a tiny house. That's the Sandman's house. You know when you see it. So I'm like, oh, okay. So I'm thinking like, okay, so that tiny house must have been the Sandman's. I'm thinking like, how the heck am I supposed to get in there? You know? And at this point, I had completely forgotten about the log. So I go all the way back to the tiny house. And I'm like, okay, is this it? No. I don't know why I thought that was the tiny house, but I'm like, oh, is this it? But no. So I'm like, I go here. And at this point, like I said, I'd completely forgotten. Don't tell me it's the Sandman's house. It's so tiny. Is this a house for ants? How do I get inside? So I'm like, wait a minute. And then at this point, I remembered the log. I'm like, oh yeah, that's right. I remembered the log. So I go over and I'm like, okay, maybe I can like you get the small going. I'm like, oh, okay, I can take it with me. So I take the log with me. And on my way back, I'm like, okay. I'm like thinking, okay, it was sideways, so I'm like, okay, maybe I have to put it sideways. So I'm like, okay, maybe I put it here. No. And in my head, I had to put it sideways. I don't know why, but I'm like, okay, maybe I put it here. Like, no, okay, that didn't work. So I'm like, okay, maybe I put it in front. So I'm like, okay, maybe I put it here. And it works. So I'm like, okay, sweet. So I'm like, okay, do I just walk in? I'm like, oh, okay, I just walk in. So at this point, I'm like, okay, this is kind of weird. I'm like, okay, ooh, nice house, you know, lots of things for me to explore. So I'm like, ooh, clicky, clicky, what's this? It's just a candle. So I'm like, okay, now let's go straight up, and I'm gonna go straight forward. Now, this floor really confused me, because I'm like, this is gonna kill me, isn't it? So I'm like, okay, let's save and see how many times I die on this floor. Turns out the floor itself doesn't kill you. I'm like, okay, I can't go backwards, so I've got to go forward. So I'm like, okay, this is not really a puzzle. It's not really that difficult, you know? And I'm pretty sure you guys may have noticed that there's a switch there, but I didn't notice it, so I just kind of walked past it. At this point, I'm like, ooh, spooky hallway. You know, this definitely means death. Let's go. You know, it's like save and go, you know? And I'm like, oh, door. You know, anything in the door? Nothing in the door. So at this point, I'm like, okay, you know, maybe I can go here. It's like, okay, it won't open. I'm like, okay, let's go back and see if we can leave. Of course we couldn't. So, start talking, you know, the Sandman comes out and everything like that. So, at this point, I had no idea what was going on. What's that in your hand? A spoon. Ah, you're still not sleepy? Then let me tell you a scary story. The terrifying story of the Sandman. The Sandman, he doesn't like kids who stay up. So he digs up their eyeballs with a spoon and makes them into stew. And I'm like, oh, okay, that's a bit disturbing, you know? That's a really weird thing to tell your kid to get them to go sleep. No, don't come near me. I'm like, okay, maybe I'm supposed to run and get out of the house. I'm like, oh, okay, I can't move. It's like, okay, let's try leaving, you know, and go. And I'm like, okay, wait, what am I supposed to do? I'm like, I can't get away. So I died. And at this point, I'm like, okay, you know, I guess I have to get away from him. So, like, the option comes up to eat and everything like that, like, in a second here. So I'm like, okay, you know, what is all this, you know, kill me. So basically, I'm like, okay, so what am I supposed to do, you know? And at this point, I'd figured that I was supposed to get away from him. That was the whole thing. So it's like, Sophie, eat up, you know? Food, eat up. So I tried doing don't eat. It didn't work. I couldn't go down to don't eat. So I'm like, okay, I guess I have to eat it. And of course, it killed me, as you can tell. You know, game over. So basically, I'm like, okay, I gotta, like, at this point I was like, okay, I gotta get away from him. You know, that's probably what they want me to do. So I decide that I'm going to, like, open the door, like, check the door, and then I was like, okay, I'm gonna save right here, so that this is where I start, you know? It's like, oh, Sandman. Like, hello, you know? And so at this point I'm thinking, like, okay, you know, I probably have to get away from him, you know, and it's like, okay, let's try this, you know? And basically at this point I'm just like, okay, yeah, you know, like, don't really reiterate the story, you know? So I'm like, okay, you know, let's try and get away from him and see if we can do it, you know, maybe that whole point of that room is, you know, a puzzle to get away from him, you know? So I start running, and I go back into the room, I'm thinking, like, okay, you know, I can't go straight down, because I didn't, like, I was thinking, like, maybe I could go down, but that didn't work. So I'm like, okay, you know, I'm like, what am I supposed to do if I can't, like, outrun him? You know, so I'm, like, sitting here, like, racking my brain, trying to figure out what I'm supposed to do. So I'm like, okay, I couldn't do don't eat again. Like, I couldn't go down, you know? I couldn't select don't eat, so I'm like, okay, you know, I'm just gonna eat, and I'm gonna try and figure this out. So basically, I died about 4 more times trying to get away from him, and then I figured that maybe I'm supposed to let him catch me without running away. So I'm like, okay, you know, maybe I'll, like, after about, like, 4 more deaths, I'm like, okay, like, here, I'm like, okay, I think I'm just going to let him catch me. I'm not gonna run away. Like, I'm just gonna let him catch me. You know, maybe that's what I'm supposed to do. So I'm like, okay, you know, I'm like, blah, 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 let's skip through this, because I've read it, like, about 8 times by this point. So I'm like, okay, you know, let's skip through, see what this is all about. So I'm like, okay, let's try this theory, you know, let's just let him catch us. And so I'm like, yeah, no, don't come near me, and I let him catch me right away. So it's like the whole thing, you know, why do you want me here? The soup is gross, you know, I'm gonna be sick. I'll die for sure, it makes me want to barf. So at this point I'm like, okay, you know, let's see if I can select it. And I was actually able to select don't eat this time. I'm like, oh yeah, okay, it's what I'm supposed to do. Eat. Don't eat. Eat it. Don't eat. Chew. Refuse. So I'm like, okay, I'm so sorry. This looks really good, but you see, I'm not hungry. It's really too bad. Really, it's a shame. I'm just too full right now to eat. I'm so sorry. At this point, I'm like, oh god, he's gonna kill me. You know, I'm thinking like, oh, he's coming over to kill me. He's gonna kill me. You know, it's like, what's gonna happen? Sandman, you're not eating? It's okay? Okay. I'm like, wait, he's just leaving? He's not gonna kill me? I'm like, oh, thank god he didn't kill me. Because at this point I had died like 8 times, so I'm like, yeah. So I figured, like, okay, you know, let's chat with these guys, see what they are. Because, like, these look like smoke, you know. Turns out that they're dust. And, yeah, we're dust. We'll help us with the Sandman. We clean up his sand. I saw you in my world, too. Are you cleaning up his sand then? Yep, that's our job. So I'm like, okay, you know, is this also dust? You know, I'm like, okay, that's also dust. So I'm like, okay, I figure this guy is also a dust. I'm like, oh, let's go see what's in this room. So I'm like, oh, you know, a lizard. Okay, that's weird. Like, why would you want a lizard? Like a large pot. And I'm like looking around, seeing if there's anything. Like, okay, there's nothing in here, so let's find out where we're supposed to go next. So I'm like, ooh, a note. So I pick it up, and I'm like, oh, a memo. Okay, let's see what this is. So I look at it, and it's like, can't read what this says. I'm like, oh, okay. I guess, like, there's something that I need to get later on in order to read it. So I decide to save here, and at this point, I'm like, okay, let's talk to this guy. You know, cleaning, because I'm bored. And so, did you do the painting on the wall? Sandman is even good at arts. So I'm like, oh, okay, you know, maybe this is like a painting that I need to keep in mind. You know, maybe there's something in there that I need. So I'm like, okay, let's take a picture. So I took a photo with my phone, and I'm like, okay, well, we got it. You know, let's go see what else there is. You know, I'm like, okay, what's in here? And I'm like, oh, pictures? I'm like, oh, okay, I guess these are pictures of kids. I had no idea what these were about, so I'm just like, okay, that's kind of weird. I'm like, oh, a memo. You know, I'm like, okay, I can't read it. So, basically, I'm like, okay, you know, let's see what else we can do. I'm like, oh, a wall full of clocks. So, I'm, like, looking around trying to figure out what I'm supposed to do. And at this point, I was utterly confused. I'm like, I have no idea where I'm supposed to go. So I'm basically checking every room for some sort of thing to send me forward. So I'm thinking like, okay, I went straight last time, so let's like try going in here. And I see this thing, and I'm like, what the heck is that? It looks like a slime. You know, and I'm like, okay, that's kind of weird. So I try clicking on it, and it doesn't really do anything. So I'm like, okay, so I guess it's just not useful to me right now. So I decide to leave. So I'm like, okay, let's go check the other side. And I look, and I'm like, oh, what's this? And I decide to see if, like, I'm like, okay, all the other ones are like that. Like, okay, I can't use the bell. My mom, is there anything else in here that I can click on? So I'm like, okay, nothing else is in here. So I decide to go back to where I was before. So I'm like, okay, let's go through here, you know, blah, 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 do the whole puzzle thing again. And I only stop on the black squares, which was kind of weird to me because, like, I had no idea what I was doing. But you stop on the black squares, which is all I know. So, yeah. But then I'm like, I noticed it. I'm like, wait a minute, what was that on the wall? So I'm like, oh, a switch. So I push the switch, and I'm like, oh my god, are you kidding me? This would have been so much easier to get away from the Sandman. But then I'm like, wait a minute, it wouldn't have mattered because I didn't need to get away from the Sandman. So I guess it's good that I didn't find it. Yeah, so I'm like, okay, that door's locked. So I'm like, wait a minute, maybe I can... I'm like, okay, let's save because he might still be in there. And maybe if I go in here, so I'm like, okay, you know, there's something in here. So I'm like, okay, what's this? So I'm like, okay, this piece of paper. So I'm like, okay, you know, let's take the note. Maybe we can read it later. So I go back in here, and I'm like, oh, it's a lullaby. So, lullaby. Hey, Sophie, took your time. Why did you go on ahead of me? You didn't say to take you to the Sandman's house. So, did you meet him? I did, but he chased me down. Then he tried to feed me some weird food. I was almost killed. Did you do something bad to him? I didn't do anything. He just chased me down with a spoon. What's wrong with spoons? Sandman digs out children's eyeballs with a spoon and eats them, doesn't he? Well, I'll bet he'd be mad if you said that. Who would eat that, he'd say. Huh? But my mom always told me... And at this point, you know, Jack was starting to get very restless and cuddly, so it's like, look, Sophie, mothers all around the world tell some tricky stories, totally straight-faced to get their noisy kids to sleep. But yeah, so at this point I was kind of like trying to combat a kitten. You know, Jack's not really a kitten anymore, but like trying to combat a kid meowing at me. So it's like all you hear is like, meow, meow. I'm like, Jack, I'm trying to record. But yeah, so anyway, but yeah, it's basically like, I'm just like, okay, you know, but after that, he tried feeding me real food. It seemed poisonous. It was so gross. You were right not to eat that. Fairy food is poisonous to humans. Yeah, that was fairy food, and I guess Like, I figured at this point he must have, like, forgotten or something like that, or he didn't realize or something like that. I'm like, okay, I guess he just wanted to feed me something, and all he had was fairy food. So, anyway, but, yeah, so at this point I'm like, well, okay, I guess this is kind of bad that he's not leading us around. So I'm like, okay, let's look around, see what we can find. And I didn't really find anything, so I'm like, okay, I'm thinking, like, maybe Lullaby can read something for me. So it's like, it's weird, I don't understand the other parts just fine. Oh, he uses special language, what is it called? Most rationalistic and logistic word strings, I think. So I'm like, oh, okay, thinking like, oh, okay, that's kind of useful. What the heck? I don't get it. He's a really smart guy, scientist, inventor, philosopher, and maybe more. He doesn't sleep, which covers a number of fields. Me, on the other hand, me and the others understand him, but I guess you don't. Tell me if you need to read anything. So I'm like, oh, okay. So I guess he can read stuff for me. So I'm like, okay, well, just like through a David Grosser. I'm the David you imagine, which may be a little different, but you like his kindness, don't you? So I'm like, okay, I'm like, let's see if he can read the memo. Hey, Lullaby, I think the Sandman dropped this memo. You know what it is? That's a memo about how to make sleeping sand. Sleeping sand. The one that puts you to sleep when it gets in your eyes. That's right. Let me see that. I'll read it. Can't understand Sandman's language, huh? So basically, at this point, I'm like, oh, okay, I need to keep an eye on this, figure out what this is. So, snore of fruit. I'm like, what the heck is that? And then, of course, Sophie asks, it's white flour with red fruit, which is the main ingredient of sleeping sand. Smell causes drowsiness, apparently. I remembered what that was. It was in one of the rooms. So I'm like, oh, sweet, I know what that is. And then it's like cryogel, like what's that? Cattle lizard. I'm like, what? I'm like, oh, okay, so I know where that thing is. Because I figured it was that gel thing, that lizard shaped thing that was going on the ground. I didn't know what the Cater lizard was, though. But, so I'm like, okay, maybe I need this for later. And basically, I'm like, okay, we'll try and figure this out. We meet this certain someone in another video, like in another episode, so I'm not really going to spoil anything about that. But it makes sense once we meet them, why. But here, I figure, like, okay, let's do the notice. Hey, Lullaby, this is on the room in the opposite wall. I didn't know what it meant by the emerald flames, so I'm like, okay, whatever, it's not anything I need. So at this point, I'm like, okay, you know what, I'm gonna end this episode here. I've gotten through quite a bit of this, and I don't really know what to do. I'm getting sleepy, I need to go lie down. So at this point, I'm like, okay, thank you so much for watching, and yeah. But thank you so much for watching, guys. I hope you enjoyed. I am sorry that's kind of weird, but I'll see you guys in the next video, whatever that may be. With that said, goodbye.